the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clung to ancient trees like memories refusing to fade, Jamie Blackwell lived alone in his weathered cabin. At 7, his calloused hands and knowing eyes reflected hardships no child should endure. When thunder split the sky one violent spring night, he discovered her, a woman of refined beauty, unconscious among the wildflowers, her elegant clothes soaked through, a wedding band still gleaming on her finger. "Come with me," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain as he carried her to safety. In the flickering lamplight, her feverish whispers revealed fragments of a privileged life shattered by loss. Why did she clutch a photograph bearing the same distinctive ridgeline visible from Jamie's porch? What dark purpose drove someone to pursue this grieving widow so far from civilization? And how could this chance encounter rewrite the painful history etched into both their souls? Jamie struggled against the worsening storm, the unconscious woman's weight threatening his balance as he navigated the treacherous path back to his cabin, rain lashing against his face like tiny needles while thunder cracked overhead with such violence it seemed to split the very air around them. His breath came in ragged clouds as he finally shouldered open the rough-hewn door, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke welcoming him home as water streamed from their bodies onto the worn floorboards, forming dark, glistening puddles in the faint glow of embers still smoldering in the stone hearth. With careful movements, he laid her on his narrow bed, her rain-soaked clothes immediately darkening his mother's hand-stitched quilt, the only memento he had of the woman who'd left this world far too soon. Moving with practiced efficiency born from years of self-reliance, Jamie stoked the dying fire until flames leapt hungrily at fresh pine logs, casting the cabin in a warm, flickering light that revealed the woman more clearly. Her skin, pale as moonlight, now flushed with fever. Her dark hair, though tangled with forest debris, framed a face of refined beauty that spoke of a world far removed from his mountain existence. As he gently removed her drenched outer garments to prevent the chill from deepening its hold, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, 2 small, perfectly round holes in the back of her expensive coat. Their edges burned and frayed in a way that made his stomach tighten with recognition. Bullet holes. The discovery sent a jolt of alertness through him, his senses suddenly as sharp as when tracking a wounded buck through dense underbrush. With renewed caution, he continued his ministrations, retrieving a basin of cool water from the rain barrel outside and tearing a clean strip from his spare shirt to bathe her burning forehead. Around her slender neck hung a delicate gold chain, its links finer than any he'd ever seen, supporting a locket of intricate craftsmanship that must have cost more than he could earn in 2 years of selling pelts and timber in town. Her fingers, long and elegant despite smudges of dirt, were adorned with a wedding band of gleaming gold and a ring bearing a diamond that caught the firelight and scattered it like captured stars across the cabin's rough walls. As Jamie carefully removed her muddied boots, a folded paper fell from where it had been hastily tucked inside, unfolding partially to reveal a torn photograph. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive ridgeline of Crow's Peak, the very same vista visible from his eastern window each morning, though photographed from an angle he'd never seen before, with strange markings in red ink circling particular features of the landscape. Throughout the night, as rain drummed against the tin roof and wind howled through the gaps in the logs, Jamie maintained his vigil, replacing the cloth on her forehead when it grew warm and feeding the fire to keep the chill at bay. Twice she stirred, eyes fluttering open with brief, terrified lucidity. The second time, her gaze fixed on her coat lying nearby, and with surprising strength, her hand shot out to grasp his wrist, her voice a hoarse whisper, "Hide it, please. They'll kill for it." Before her fingers weakened, and she slipped once more into feverish unconsciousness, leaving Jamie with prickling unease crawling along his spine like winter frost. His mind racing with questions about what circumstances had brought this mysterious woman to his isolated corner of the mountains, and more troublingly, what, or who, might be following her trail. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting golden rectangles across the rough floor as the woman finally stirred from her fevered sleep, her eyes fluttering open to reveal irises the color of summer storm clouds, disorientation quickly giving way to alarm as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. She bolted upright with a sudden gasp, wincing at the movement before pressing herself against the wall, her gaze darting frantically around the cabin until landing on Jamie, who sat quietly whittling by the fire, his posture deliberately relaxed to appear non-threatening despite the tension he felt witnessing her fear. "You're safe here," he said, keeping his voice gentle and even, the way he would approach a wounded fox, setting aside his carving and lifting his empty palms to show he meant no harm. Found you collapsed in the storm last night, brought you here to get warm and dry. Her shoulders remained rigid, hands clutching the quilt to her chest, as if it might shield her from unknown dangers. Though a flicker of calculation passed behind her eyes, assessing him, the cabin, and whatever memory she retained of her circumstances. Thank you, she finally offered, her voice cultured and refined despite its hoarseness, carrying inflections Jamie had only heard from occasional wealthy hunters who passed through these mountains for sport rather than survival. My name is Eliza, she added after a lengthy pause, each word seemingly measured for safety. Eliza Harrington. A widow from Boston. Jamie nodded, not pressing for the explanations hanging unspoken in the air between them, instead rising slowly to ladle broth from the pot simmering over the fire into a chipped enamel bowl. She accepted it with hands that, despite their evident exhaustion, held the crude vessel with the same poise they might a fine china teacup, her every movement speaking of a life utterly foreign to his own mountain existence. As she sipped the simple broth, Jamie noticed how her gaze lingered on the cabin's sparse furnishings, with neither judgment nor pity, but something closer to curiosity, as if his handmade table and chairs, the shelves lined with preserved foods, and the pelts hanging from hooks were artifacts from another world entirely. I should leave soon, she announced, though her pallor and the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her body's disagreement with this plan. Before Jamie could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest outside, possibly a branch breaking under the weight of last night's rainfall, but it sent an immediate transformation through Eliza, her face draining of what little color it had regained, the bowl slipping from her grasp and spilling across the quilt as her eyes widened with naked terror. In an instant, she was no longer the composed, elegant widow, but something hunted and desperate, her fingers digging into Jamie's forearm as he moved to retrieve the fallen bowl. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking with urgency that seemed to compress the air in the cabin. Please don't tell anyone I'm here. No one can know. Promise me. Her eyes, now brimming with tears she stubbornly refused to let fall, held his with such raw fear that Jamie felt something protective and fierce awaken inside him, a sensation both foreign and familiar, as if his solitary existence had been preparing him for this moment when another soul would need the sanctuary only he could provide in these remote mountains that had both isolated and sheltered him for so long. As Eliza drifted back to sleep, her breath evening out into the gentle rhythm of healing, Jamie settled into the worn chair by the hearth, his mind wandering back through the fog of memory to that rain-soaked April morning 5 years ago, when Sheriff Miller had trudged up the muddy path to deliver news that would cleave his life into before and after. His father and mother had been found in their overturned wagon at the bottom of Serpent's Ridge, a treacherous stretch of road his father had navigated hundreds of times without incident. The whispers had started at the funeral, carried on the wind like poison as neighbors who had always greeted him with smiles now averted their eyes or made hasty signs of the cross when the Blackwell boy passed. Just like his grandfather, they murmured behind cupped hands, and his great-uncle before that, both found dead in strange circumstances. The legend of the Blackwell curse spread through the town like wildfire, fueled by generations of misfortune and the undeniable fact that their family had always been different, a bit apart, with Jamie's father Samuel refusing mining work that sustained most families, instead venturing deep into the mountains for weeks at a time on mysterious business of his own. The town council had debated what to do with the orphaned boy, some arguing he should be sent to the county home 50 miles away, but old Martha had stood up in the meeting house, her crooked spine suddenly straight as steel, declaring that the Blackwells had been neighbors for 4 generations, and she would make sure the boy had what he needed. That night, Jamie had hidden himself away in the cabin, barricading the door with his father's rifle across his knees, determined that no one would take him from the only home he had left. Through that first brutal winter alone, he survived on skills his father had insisted he master from the time he could walk, his voice a constant presence in Jamie's mind. Always check your snares before first light, son, when the night hunters are returning home. And pine resin will seal a wound better than any town doctor's stitches. Samuel Blackwell had prepared his son for a world that might turn against him, teaching him to read animal tracks, to find water in hidden springs, to preserve meat without salt when supplies ran low, and most importantly, to trust the mountains more than the fickleness of human charity. Only old Martha had proven the exception to his father's warnings, appearing at his door with quiet regularity, never asking to come inside or offering pity that would have burned worse than winter frost. She simply left what he needed on the stoop, practical offerings from someone who understood mountain pride, beans and cornmeal in the early days, then seeds once spring arrived, occasionally remedies for ailments she somehow intuited before he developed symptoms. Years passed in this manner, with Jamie growing like a wild thing, his contact with the town dwindling to brief, necessary trips for items he couldn't produce himself, enduring the stares and hushed conversations that still followed him through the general store. He learned to wrap solitude around himself like armor, finding companionship in the constant dialogue with these mountains, whose moods and seasons he came to read as clearly as others might read a friend's expressions. The isolation that had first felt like punishment gradually transformed into something chosen and fiercely guarded, a freedom most would never understand, but which had forged him into someone capable of surviving anything, until this strange morning when another human's fear had somehow breached the careful walls he had constructed around his heart. The fever held Eliza in its grip for 3 days, her consciousness surfacing and submerging like a water bird in a storm-tossed lake, moments of lucidity, quickly giving way to troubled sleep, where her secrets escaped through unguarded lips. Jamie kept vigil, replacing cool cloths on her forehead, coaxing broth and herbal tea between her parched lips, and listening as her nightmares painted fragmented pictures of a life he could barely comprehend. "The documents prove everything," she would mutter, her slender fingers clutching at phantoms in the air, her voice shifting from terrified whispers to urgent commands. "Richard knows about the inheritance. Richard always knew." The name emerged from her lips like a curse, her body tensing whenever she spoke it, as though the mere sound might summon its owner into the cabin. On the 3rd night, as rain returned to drum against the roof in gentle counterpoint to the crackling fire, Eliza's thrashing became so violent that the golden locket around her neck broke free from beneath her borrowed nightshirt, its chain tangling around her flailing hand. Gently freeing her from its grasp, Jamie noticed something odd about the locket's weight, heavier than it appeared, its surface catching the firelight in a way that revealed nearly invisible seams along its edge that seemed out of place in such fine craftsmanship. Curiosity, a trait his father had called both his blessing and his curse, compelled him to examine it closer, his calloused fingertips detecting a small depression that yielded to pressure with a satisfying click. The locket's face slid sideways, revealing not just the torn photograph of the mountain ridge he had glimpsed earlier, but a hidden compartment behind it, so cleverly crafted that even the most thorough inspection would have missed it. Within this secret space lay a triangular scrap of thick paper, yellowed with age and bearing partial markings in faded ink. Strange symbols and numbers that meant nothing to Jamie, until his gaze drifted to the corner of the cabin where his father's wooden box sat untouched on the highest shelf, exactly where it had been placed on the last day of Samuel Blackwell's life. Against his father's explicit instruction never to open the box until his 18th birthday, still 3 months away, Jamie retrieved it with trembling hands, dust coating his fingers as he set it on the table beside Eliza's locket. The box had always been beautiful to him, carved from a single piece of cherry wood, its surface adorned with intricate patterns his father had spent winters perfecting, but now Jamie noticed something he had overlooked in all the years of its familiar presence. Along the box's edge ran a series of small symbols, partially obscured by age and handling, but unmistakably similar to those on the paper fragment from Eliza's locket. Holding the triangular scrap near the box's corner, his breath caught as the markings aligned perfectly, like puzzle pieces finding their match. The partial map in the locket completing a section of the pattern on the box, revealing what looked like surveyor's notations and elevation markers his father had disguised within decorative carvings. In that moment, as Eliza murmured Harrington in her troubled sleep, a cold certainty settled in Jamie's chest, heavy as November frost. That whatever connection existed between this refined Boston widow and his mountain-wise father was no chance encounter but something deliberately hidden, something people had died to protect or possess, and the evidence lay in his hands, bridging worlds he had always believed could never touch. Dawn arrived with fingers of gold light stretching through the pines as Jamie moved silently through the forest, crossbow in hand, tracking a young buck whose hoofprints promised meat that would sustain them through the coming weeks. The previous days had established a careful rhythm between him and Eliza as her strength gradually returned, her fever breaking to reveal a sharp intelligence behind those storm cloud eyes, though she remained guarded about everything beyond her name and widowed status. His practiced gaze followed the deer trail along the creek bed until an anomaly caught his attention, halting him mid-stride, muscles tensing like a predator scenting danger. There, cutting across the animal tracks, stretched a line of boot prints too large and deep to be his own, the tread pattern unfamiliar and city-made, lacking the worn smoothness of local hunters who knew these woods. One set became 3, then 5, spreading outward in a deliberate search pattern that spoke of methodical hunting, not for game, but for something or someone they had tracked to this remote valley. Jamie abandoned the buck trail immediately, crouching to examine the prints more closely, noting their freshness in the soft earth, no more than a few hours old, their direction alarmingly close to the hidden path that led toward his cabin. Keeping to the densest cover, he circled wide around the strange tracks, stopping twice when distant sounds of branches breaking and hushed voices carried through the otherwise silent forest, confirming his fears that strangers had penetrated deeper into his territory than any outsiders had ventured in years. The journey back to the cabin became a desperate race against unknown threats, Jamie moving with the fluid grace his father had instilled through countless lessons in becoming invisible within these mountains. As the clearing around his cabin came into view, his pulse stuttered at the sight of the door standing ajar. Inside, he found Eliza struggling to dress in her now clean but still damaged clothes, her movements betraying weakness she seemed determined to overcome, her face set with grim resolution. "I must go," she stated with quiet finality, though her pallor and trembling hands undermined her determined tone. "I have already endangered you more than I can bear." Jamie set his crossbow down carefully, choosing words with uncharacteristic deliberation. "There are men searching the forest, 5 at least, with city boots and quiet voices, moving in patterns like they hunt something precious." The effect of his words struck Eliza visibly, color draining from her face as her legs buckled beneath her. Jamie lunging forward to catch her before she collapsed entirely onto the rough wooden floor. As he lowered her gently to the chair, her fingers dug into his forearms with surprising strength, her composure cracking like spring ice to reveal the raw terror beneath. "They will kill me," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word, tears finally breaching the careful dignity she had maintained even through fever and pain. "And they will kill anyone who helps me, just as they killed Charles when he discovered what they had done." The cabin grew still as night settled around them, darkness gathering in the corners while the fire cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, its warmth creating an intimate circle that somehow made truth easier to bear. Eliza sat wrapped in one of Jamie's worn blankets, her fingers curled around a steaming mug of pine needle tea, her eyes fixed on the flames as though reading her past in their flickering patterns. "My husband, Charles Harrington, was not merely wealthy but principled," she began, her voice low and steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "The Harrington Mining Company has been in his family for generations, with operations across New England, but Charles saw it as more than a source of fortune. He believed industry could work in harmony with the land and its people." She paused, taking a sip of tea, the firelight catching the gold of her wedding band. "6 months ago I found him in his study, slumped over his desk with a bullet wound in his temple and a pistol beside his hand. His business partner, Richard Thornton, arrived moments after my screams brought the servants running. Richard took control immediately, calling it suicide from business pressures." Her voice hardened, the refined Boston accent giving way to something raw. "I believed him until I found Charles's hidden journal 3 weeks later, concealed behind books in our library. The final entries detailed his discovery of falsified land surveys here in the Appalachians, mineral rights being purchased for pittances from people who had no idea what lay beneath their family farms." Jamie watched her face transform as she spoke, grief giving way to a cold anger that straightened her spine. Charles had uncovered a massive fraud orchestrated by Richard, involving bribes to government officials and strategic acquisitions that would allow them to extract rare minerals worth billions, destroying entire communities and poisoning watersheds in the process. The night before his death, Charles wrote that he had secured final proof from a local surveyor who had initially discovered the deposits but refused to be part of the scheme. She reached inside her blouse to withdraw the locket. 3 days ago, I finally decoded the numbers in Charles's journal. They led to a bank box containing these map fragments and letters documenting the conspiracy. I had just returned home when I found our butler dead in the foyer and 2 men waiting in the shadows." Her voice faltered, her hand unconsciously moving to her side where Jamie knew bruises still bloomed beneath her borrowed clothes. I escaped through the servants' entrance with only what I carried, fleeing first by train, then by hired car, and finally on foot when I realized they were still following. I had memorized the location from Charles's notes, knowing I needed to find the original surveyor who could verify the documents. Her gaze shifted to the wooden box on Jamie's shelf, understanding dawning in her eyes. Samuel Blackwell, Jamie said quietly, the name falling between them like a stone into still water. My father was a surveyor before I was born. He moved us deep into these mountains when I was just a child, taught me to distrust outsiders, and made me promise never to speak of the box until my 18th birthday. Eliza's breath caught audibly. Your father was the witness Charles mentioned, the one who refused to be part of their plans, the one who disappeared with the original survey documents. She reached for Jamie's hand, the touch of her refined fingers against his calloused palm, bridging worlds that had been separated by design but connected by blood and betrayal. They didn't just find your father again after all these years, Jamie. They killed him for what he knew. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin window as Jamie climbed onto the rough-hewn stool to reach the highest shelf, where the box had rested untouched since his father placed it there with solemn ceremony on his 12th birthday. This holds truths that will shape your future, son, but not until you have the wisdom of 18 years to bear their weight, his father had said, his voice carrying the same grave certainty that accompanied all his most important lessons. The box settled into Jamie's palms with familiar weight, the cherry wood warm and alive even after years of waiting, its surface polished to a soft glow by his father's careful hands during the long winter evenings when Samuel would work on it by firelight, never allowing Jamie to see its contents, though permitting him to trace the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. Eliza watched with intent focus as he placed it on the table between them, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, eyes widening with recognition as her fingers hovered over the patterns without quite touching them. These symbols, she whispered, reaching for her locket and placing it beside the box. They match exactly, not just similar but identical. Carved by the same hand or copied with extraordinary precision. Jamie nodded, watching as she aligned the triangular fragment from her locket with one corner of the box, the markings flowing seamlessly together like separated pieces of the same fabric finally reunited. His calloused finger traced a small insignia nestled within the larger pattern, a stylized mountain peak with a pickaxe crossing through it, barely noticeable unless one knew to look for it. This was always my favorite part of the design, he said softly. Father told me it represented our connection to these mountains, that whatever path I chose in life, I should remember that mountains endure while men merely pass through their shadows. Eliza's sharp intake of breath drew his attention as her finger pointed to an identical mark etched into the back of her locket, previously hidden by tarnish but now unmistakable in the morning light. This is the original Harrington Mining Company seal, she explained, her voice tight with emotion. Charles showed it to me once, said it was designed by his grandfather who founded the company, before they modernized the logo to something more corporate. The implications settled around them like invisible snow, cold and transforming. Your father didn't just disappear from the company, Eliza continued, her analytical mind assembling the puzzle pieces with remarkable speed. He was connected to the Harringtons before that, trusted enough to use their symbol, to have access to proprietary surveys and company secrets. Jamie felt a strange lightness in his chest, as though some burden he had carried without knowing had suddenly been named. All these years thinking we were hiding from something nameless, he said, his voice rough with emotions he rarely permitted himself to feel. When all along it was your husband's family we were connected to, your husband's partner we were hiding from. He looked up to find Eliza's storm-gray eyes studying him with new understanding. The refined Boston widow and the mountain-raised orphan suddenly revealed not as random strangers thrown together by chance, but as two pieces of a larger story. We should open it, Eliza said softly, her fingers resting lightly on the box's ornate clasp. Whatever your father was protecting, whatever Charles died for, it's all connected to what's in this box. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to Jamie's solitary existence. Hours no longer marked solely by the sun's passage but by small victories as Eliza's strength returned and her determination grew, her refined hands now learning the rough wisdom of mountain survival. Jamie found himself speaking more words each day than he had in the previous year, his usual silence giving way to practical instructions as he showed her how to identify edible plants, differentiate animal tracks, and move through dense underbrush without leaving trails. Lower your center, Step with the outer edge of your foot first, he explained as they practiced walking silently through the forest near the cabin. The city widow awkward at first, but surprisingly quick to adapt, her intelligence compensating for her lack of experience. In turn, Eliza shared knowledge from her world, explaining complex business mechanisms that had allowed Richard to manipulate land acquisitions and mineral rights. Her methodical mind connecting pieces of information Jamie would have overlooked, their different perspectives forming a more complete understanding of what they faced. Small moments of unexpected connection emerged between lessons, like when Jamie found Eliza smiling at his unconscious habit of whistling bird calls while he worked, or when he caught her perfectly mimicking his precise method of banking the fire for the night. Neither acknowledging these observations aloud, but both feeling the subtle shift as two strangers became reluctant allies in a shared battle. On the fourth day, Jamie returned from checking his trapline to find Eliza practicing with his spare hunting knife. Her form imperfect but her focus absolute, the refined Boston widow transformed by necessity into something fiercer, something that could survive in his world. That same afternoon brought troubling news when Jamie ventured close enough to town to observe without being seen, watching as three unfamiliar men in crisp suits that marked them as outsiders moved purposefully through the main street, showing photographs to shopkeepers and eventually making their way to old Martha's small house at the edge of town. Hidden behind the gnarled oak that had been his lookout since childhood, Jamie felt cold dread pool in his stomach as the men presented papers that caused even stubborn Martha to admit them inside. Their conversation hidden but their purpose clear in the official vehicle parked nearby and the practiced way they surveyed their surroundings, like hunters assessing terrain. That night, after returning to the cabin and sharing what he had seen, Jamie and Eliza worked together until well past midnight, stringing nearly invisible threads attached to small bells across likely approach paths, digging a concealed pit along the main trail that would not injure but would delay and alert, and most importantly, preparing emergency packs containing essentials that could be grabbed in seconds if they needed to flee. My father had 3 different escape routes mapped out, Jamie explained as he showed Eliza a crude drawing etched into the cabin's rear support beam, previously hidden behind a stack of firewood. This one leads to a cave system that runs deep into the mountain. This one follows a stream bed that masks tracks, and this one cuts across the ridge where only someone who knows these mountains would dare to travel. As they finally settled before the dying fire, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath Eliza's eyes, but resolve hardening her features into something that mirrored Jamie's own determination, he realized that in teaching her to survive, he had given her the power to leave safely if she chose. Yet the thought of returning to his solitude now felt strangely hollow, as though in just a few days, this woman from another world had somehow become essential to his own. The new moon cast no betraying light as Jamie moved like a shadow along the overgrown deer trail that connected his isolated valley to the outskirts of town, every sense heightened for signs of the strangers who had been combing the mountains for days. He had waited until absolute necessity forced this dangerous journey, their supplies dwindling to concerning levels, after a week of supporting 2 instead of his usual solitary existence. Rather than risk the general store where questions would certainly follow his rare appearance, Jamie slipped through the back gardens of the town's edge until he reached the small, crooked house where old Martha had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. 3 soft taps on her back window, a signal established years ago, brought her shuffling to the door, her wizened face betraying no surprise at his midnight appearance, though her eyes narrowed with concern as she quickly ushered him inside. "Those men been back twice more," she said without preamble, her gnarled hands already filling a cloth sack with cornmeal, coffee, and salt, while Jamie added supplies from his carefully saved money. Showing fancy papers claiming they federal agents looking for a dangerous woman escaped from custody, offering good money for information. Martha's voice dropped lower, her rheumy eyes darting to the window despite the drawn curtains, caution ingrained from decades of mountain discretion. They described her real particular, said she stole valuable documents and might be injured or seeking help, but something in their manner rang false as a $3 bill, especially how their hands never strayed far from their coats where guns surely waited. She pressed a jar of her prized blackberry preserves into the bag, a luxury she normally saved for Christmas, her silent way of expressing her worry. "Been asking questions about you too, boy, whether anyone had seen you in town lately, or knew where exactly you made your home up in those mountains." Jamie felt his muscles tense. But Martha's next words froze him entirely, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "Got me remembering things from before you were born, when your daddy first came to these parts. All educated and carrying fine instruments for measuring and mapping." She tied the sack closed with careful precision, her voice soft with the weight of long-held secrets. Folks said Samuel Blackwell worked for some big northern mining company back then, living in town proper and sending reports off by post each month, until something changed him almost overnight. Made him buy that remote patch of land and build that cabin where no one could find him easy. She pressed the bundle into Jamie's hands, her fingers lingering on his with surprising strength. "Your daddy was a good man who chose these mountains over whatever money they offered him, chose to raise you away from whatever he was running from. And now I reckon it finally caught up despite all his caution." Her eyes, sharp despite her age, held his with fierce intensity. "Whatever that woman brought to your door, it connects to your father's secrets, and these men carry death in their pockets, not justice." Jamie slipped away into the protective darkness with Martha's provisions and warnings weighing equally heavy in his hands, his path back to the cabin more circuitous than his journey into town, doubling back across rocky outcroppings and wading through shallow streams to obscure his trail, the pieces of his father's hidden past and Eliza's desperate present merging into a single dangerous puzzle whose solution might cost them both their lives. The baying of hounds shattered the dawn silence, the sound distant but unmistakable as it echoed through the valley, sending birds scattering from treetops in panicked flurries. Jamie bolted upright from where he had been repairing a snare, his body tensing like a deer scenting predators while Eliza emerged from the cabin, question dying on her lips as she registered his expression. "Hunting dogs," he whispered, already gathering their emergency packs with practiced efficiency. "Not locals. They would never hunt this close to my territory." Within minutes they were moving swiftly through the forest, Jamie leading while Eliza followed precisely in his footsteps as he had taught her, both keeping low beneath the undergrowth as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. The terrain grew increasingly steep and rocky as Jamie guided them along a barely visible game trail that wound upward through dense rhododendron thickets and around massive boulders left by ancient glaciers. Their progress slow but deliberate, each step placed with care to leave minimal signs of their passage. After nearly an hour of grueling ascent, the distant rush of water reached them, growing louder until they emerged onto a narrow ledge where a modest waterfall cascaded down the mountainside, its spray creating a perpetual rainbow in the morning light. "Behind the water," Jamie instructed, gesturing to a dark shadow barely visible through the silvery curtain of tumbling water. "Step exactly where I step. The rocks are slippery." They edged sideways along the precarious path, pressed against slick stone as cold spray soaked their clothes, until Jamie ducked suddenly through an opening and pulled Eliza after him into the cool darkness beyond. The cave opened before them like a secret room, surprisingly spacious and dry beyond the waterfall's reach, with enough ambient light filtering through the water to reveal a natural chamber that Jamie had clearly used before, judging by the small stack of firewood and primitive stone hearth arranged near the center. As Eliza caught her breath, Jamie struck a match to light a small oil lamp he retrieved from a niche in the wall, its warm glow revealing more of their sanctuary, including something that made Eliza move forward with newfound urgency. The far wall of the cave was covered with markings, some clearly made by a child's hand, but others precise and technical, drawn with the skill of a professional. "My father brought me here when I was small," Jamie explained, watching as Eliza studied the wall with intense focus. "Said it was our special place where we could speak freely away from unfriendly ears." Eliza's fingers traced over a series of symbols and numbers, her breath catching as she recognized patterns similar to those in her husband's journal. "Jamie, these aren't random markings," she whispered, voice filled with dawning comprehension. "These are sophisticated geological survey notations indicating rare earth mineral deposits, the kind used in advanced electronics and military applications. Worth billions to whoever controls them." She pointed to a specific cluster of symbols near the bottom of the wall. "This notation here indicates concentrations of neodymium and dysprosium that exceed any known domestic source by factors of 10, enough to shift the balance of industrial power away from foreign dependencies." Her eyes met his, wide with realization. "Your father wasn't just a surveyor who walked away from a job, Jamie. He discovered what might be the most valuable mineral deposit in North America. And rather than reveal it to people who would destroy these mountains to extract it, he chose to protect it, even at the cost of living in hiding for the rest of his life. The trek back to the cabin was tense, every sound in the forest a potential threat as they navigated carefully chosen paths to confuse any tracking dogs. Night had fallen by the time they slipped inside, securing the door behind them as Jamie stood before the cherry wood box, his father's final instruction weighing against their desperate circumstances. 3 months until my birthday, he murmured, running his hand along the intricate carvings. But we don't have 3 months anymore. The decision formed not as betrayal, but as necessity, honoring his father's purpose rather than merely his words. The brass clasp yielded easily, as though it had been waiting for precisely this moment, revealing several folders of yellowed papers, a small leather journal, and a velvet pouch nestled in faded red velvet lining. Jamie lifted the topmost folder with careful hands, its cover bearing the Harrington Mining Company insignia, the pages inside filled with his father's precise handwriting alongside official letterhead documents. Chief Geological Surveyor, Eliza whispered, pointing to Samuel Blackwell's title. He wasn't just working for them. He was leading their entire exploration division. The documents told a story of discovery and betrayal, with survey reports showing mineral deposits of unprecedented value throughout these mountains, followed by internal memos revealing the company's true intentions. Jamie's throat tightened as he read his father's journal entries, the initial excitement of scientific discovery transforming into horror as Samuel uncovered the company's plans. They falsified environmental impact studies, Jamie read aloud, concealed water contamination projections that would poison 3 counties downstream, planned to forcibly relocate 7 communities through manipulated eminent domain claims. The final entry, dated weeks before his parents' deaths, contained words that made Jamie's hands tremble. I cannot be party to this destruction, cannot allow my discovery to become a weapon against these mountains and their people. I have removed all original survey data and destroyed duplicates, leaving only misleading fragments. Charles Harrington alone knows of my decision and has promised protection, though it means I must disappear with Mary and the boy. Must raise Jamie to understand that some treasures are not meant to be taken from the earth. Among the papers lay a detailed map, unlike the fragmented versions in Eliza's locket, showing the true locations of the mineral deposits spread across land owned by families who had lived there for generations, alongside a letter signed by Charles Harrington, promising to protect both the information and the Blackwell family from those within the company who value profit above all else. The simple truth of his father's complete to us sacrifice settled around Jamie's shoulders not as burden but as inheritance, the legacy of a man who had chosen principle over wealth, protection over profit, and in doing so had set in motion events that would eventually claim his life but had preserved both the mountains he loved and the son who would continue his stand against those who would destroy them for gain. Your father and my husband, Eliza said softly, her refined hand covering Jamie's calloused one where it rested on the journal. They died protecting the same secret, the same people. These mountains that Richard would destroy without hesitation if he knew what truly lay beneath them. Morning light filtered through the cabin window as Eliza spread Charles's journal pages beside Samuel's documents on the rough wooden table, her fingers tracing connections between the 2 men's handwriting as though physically linking their separate worlds. I knew I had seen the name Samuel Blackwell before, she said, her voice hushed with revelation as she pointed to a passage in her husband's private notes where Jamie's father was mentioned repeatedly as S.B., the witness whose testimony will bring the truth to light. The pages told a story of clandestine meetings and carefully gathered evidence, Charles working from within the company's highest circles while Samuel provided the technical expertise to prove environmental reports had been deliberately falsified. Charles was preparing a complete exposé, Eliza explained, her analytical mind assembling the fragmented narrative with remarkable clarity. Not just about the mineral deposits themselves, but the criminal conspiracy to obtain them through fraudulent means, the bribes to local officials, the threatened coercion of landowners who refused to sell. Jamie watched as she opened her locket once more, removing the photograph fragment with newly gentle reverence, understanding now the true significance of the image that had first connected them. This photograph was taken by your father, she said, certainty in her voice as she compared it to survey photographs in Samuel's files that showed the same distinctive composition style. Charles kept it as proof of their collaboration and the exact location they were working to protect. The dates in both men's journals suddenly aligned with terrible significance. Samuel's final entry coming just 2 weeks before the accident that claimed his and Mary Blackwell's lives, while Charles's last written words were penned merely 3 days before his supposed suicide. "They killed them both," Jamie said, the simple truth somehow more devastating in its plainness, his voice steady despite the grief and rage building beneath it like spring floodwaters behind winter ice. "Within weeks of each other, making one look like an accident and the other like suicide, because together they could have exposed everything." Eliza nodded, her refined composure momentarily cracking to reveal raw pain as she placed her hand over Jamie's, the unlikely connection between Boston socialite and mountain boy crystallizing into something profound and unbreakable. "Our families were already connected, Jamie, long before I stumbled into your clearing," she said, her storm-gray eyes holding his with fierce intensity. "Bound by principles strong enough that both our fathers gave their lives rather than surrender them, trusting that someday the truth they protected would find its way into the right hands." Jamie felt the weight of this shared legacy settle around him, not as burden but as purpose. The isolation that had defined his existence since his parents' death suddenly transformed into a link in a chain of protection that stretched back years before his birth. "The surveying equipment in the cave," he said slowly, pieces falling into place like the complex puzzles his father had taught him to solve on winter evenings. "The hidden maps, the warnings about strangers, even the location of this cabin itself. It was all part of his plan to guard what he had found, to keep me safe until I was old enough to understand." Outside, a sudden wind moved through the trees, making the cabin creak like a living thing around them, while inside, 2 orphans from different worlds found themselves joined by loss and purpose stronger than blood, their separate griefs merging into shared resolve as they silently acknowledged that what their fathers had begun, they must now finish, no matter the cost to themselves. Their dwindling supplies forced Jamie's hand as the early morning mist clung to the valley, promising brief concealment for his dangerous journey into town, where he planned to visit only old Martha rather than risk the more populated general store. The familiar trail felt different now, every shadow potentially harboring watchful eyes as he moved with the silent caution his father had instilled in him since childhood. The weight of Samuel's journal secure in his inner pocket, alongside the meager funds that would purchase their necessities. The town appeared deceptively peaceful in the hazy morning light, windows still dark in most homes, as Jamie slipped between buildings toward Martha's small house at the edge of the settlement, his senses alert for anything unusual in the familiar landscape of his infrequent visits. His first warning came as Martha's door opened before he knocked, her ancient face tight with fear rather than her usual stern welcome, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear as a sharp crack split the air and splinters exploded from the doorframe inches from his head. Jamie dropped instinctively, years of hunting reflexes saving him as a second shot tore through the space where he had stood. Martha's cry lost in the sudden chaos as he glimpsed 3 men emerging from the shadows of neighboring buildings, their suits incongruous against the rural backdrop but their weapons and intent unmistakable. He bolted toward the cover of forest, zigzagging between obstacles as bullets kicked up dirt at his heels, one burning across his upper arm in a line of fire that nearly sent him stumbling before the trees finally enveloped him in protective shadows. Blood soaked his sleeve as he pushed deeper into the forest, taking a circuitous route back toward the hidden cave rather than risk leading the pursuers to the cabin, each step a battle against the growing weakness in his limbs as the wound sapped his strength alongside the precious blood that marked his trail, despite his efforts to conceal it. The familiar waterfall came as blessed relief after hours of punishing travel, Eliza's shocked face appearing at the cave entrance as he staggered through the watery curtain, her hands immediately steady as she helped him inside and began tending the bullet graze with surprising competence, her refined fingers now confident with the healing herbs he had taught her to identify. They were waiting, Jamie managed through gritted teeth as she cleaned the wound, the betrayal burning almost as fiercely as the injury. Someone in town must have recognized me from their questions and alerted them for whatever reward they're offering. Eliza's face hardened as she secured the bandage around his arm, her transformation from frightened widow to determined survivor, now complete in the days they had shared. "We can't stay here," she said, voicing the reality they both understood as she gathered their limited supplies with efficient movements. "They'll have trackers looking for blood trails, and once they find this cave, we'll be trapped with no escape." Jamie nodded grimly, already calculating their options as he forced his body to obey despite its protests. Knowing that movement meant survival, while stillness promised only death in the face of hunters who had spent years and fortunes seeking what they carried. "There's one place we might find help," he said, retrieving his father's map from its hiding place. "But it means crossing the highest ridge and leaving these mountains entirely, trusting someone my father mentioned only once, a journalist in the city who helped Charles gather evidence against Richard and his conspirators." The ascent toward the distant ridge began as first light painted the eastern sky, their path deliberately chosen to avoid natural funnels where trackers would expect them to travel, instead taking them through the roughest terrain where Jamie's lifetime of mountain knowledge gave them their only advantage against pursuers with superior numbers and resources. The first hours passed in determined silence, Jamie setting a punishing pace despite his wounded arm, while Eliza followed without complaint, her city boots already worn through in places from days of unaccustomed hiking, yet she pressed forward with quiet determination that spoke louder than words. By midday, when they paused briefly beside a narrow stream to refill water skins and check Jamie's bandage, the first real friction sparked between them as Eliza questioned his chosen route that seemed to lead them away from rather than toward their destination. "We're losing elevation when we should be climbing," she stated with the same analytical precision she had applied to business documents in her previous life, pointing to landmarks visible through breaks in the forest canopy. "Efficiency dictates we should maintain a more direct line toward the ridge." Jamie felt a flash of irritation at having his wilderness judgment questioned by someone who had likely never spent a night outdoors before. Stumbling into his clearing a week earlier, his response sharper than intended as he explained that the obvious path was precisely where they would be expected, the lower route providing both cover and access to water sources marked on his father's map. The tension hung between them through the afternoon's grueling travel, until they encountered a ravine too steep to navigate safely, forcing them to backtrack along exactly the path Eliza had initially suggested, her vindication expressed only through a brief glance that somehow conveyed volumes without a single word. As twilight approached, rain began falling in heavy sheets that transformed the forest floor into treacherous mud, branches whipping against their faces and roots threatening to snare exhausted feet with every step, conditions that would have broken most people accustomed to comfortable lives. Jamie expected complaints but received only steady perseverance. As Eliza matched his pace, her soaked clothes clinging to her slender frame, her hands bleeding from falls yet reaching out to steady him when his wounded arm caused him to stumble on particularly treacherous ground. They found shelter beneath a rock outcropping as darkness claimed the forest completely, huddled together for warmth with the small fire Jamie managed to coax from damp kindling casting faint light on their exhausted faces. "You surprise me," Jamie admitted as they shared the meager rations from their packs, his respect evident in the simple statement that encompassed all he had observed throughout the punishing day. "Most people from your world would have collapsed hours ago." Eliza's tired smile transformed her mud-streaked face, the refined Boston widow momentarily visible beneath the grime of their journey. "My world had different challenges," she replied, her voice soft but strong. "Boardrooms where men tried to make me invisible after Charles died, society events where whispers followed like shadows, learning to navigate treacherous terrain where the dangers wore expensive suits instead of baring teeth and claws." Something shifted between them in that moment. Mutual understanding blooming from shared hardship as Jamie recognized that her strength had been forged in different fires but was no less genuine than his own, while Eliza acknowledged that his gruff protectiveness stemmed not from doubt of her capabilities but from the same fierce loyalty that had driven his father to protect these mountains at the cost of his life. The storm descended without warning on their third day of travel, the sky darkening to an ominous purple-black before unleashing fury that bent trees horizontal and turned gentle streams into raging torrents, forcing them off their planned route as lightning split ancient oaks mere yards from their path. Blinded by sheets of driving rain and deafened by thunder that shook the very ground beneath their feet, they stumbled forward until Eliza spotted the dark outline of a structure nestled against a rocky hillside, a small hunter's cabin long abandoned, judging by the sagging roof and vegetation reclaiming its outer walls. Inside, the musty space offered blessed relief from the tempest, its single room containing a rusted wood stove, crude sleeping platform, and surprisingly dry firewood stacked neatly in one corner, evidence that occasional travelers still maintained this wilderness refuge. Jamie collapsed onto the rough-hewn bench as Eliza secured the door against howling wind, his face alarmingly pale in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. the bandage on his arm now soaked through with a worrying mixture of rain and fresh blood. "Let me see," she insisted, gently removing the sodden wrapping to reveal angry red flesh surrounding the bullet wound, heat radiating from the inflamed skin that bore telltale streaks of infection spreading toward his shoulder. Working with focused efficiency, Eliza built a small fire in the wood stove before sterilizing her knife blade in its flames, using it to carefully clean the festering wound while Jamie bit down on a leather belt to prevent his cries from echoing through the thin walls. By nightfall, fever had claimed him completely, his body alternating between violent shivering and burning heat as Eliza maintained her vigil, applying cool compresses torn from her own clothing and forcing sips of water between his cracked lips whenever consciousness briefly returned. Through the darkest hours, as rain drummed relentlessly against the cabin roof, Jamie's delirium loosened words that would never have escaped his waking mind. Confessions tumbling forth in broken phrases that Eliza gathered like precious stones. "Always alone," he murmured, his calloused hand clutching hers with surprising strength despite his weakness, watching town children playing together. Their laughter like birds calling to each other while I stood silent in the trees, never belonging, never invited. Later, as lightning illuminated the cabin in brief, ghostly flashes, his fever-bright eyes fixed on her face with painful clarity. "You see me?" he whispered, wonder in his voice. Not just the mountain boy, not just Samuel Blackwell's orphaned son, but me, Jamie. The person beneath the silence. Most revealing came near dawn, when fever finally began to relent and his words gained coherence, though he remained caught between waking and dreams. "Never thought I could feel this," he confessed, fingers gently brushing her cheek with a tenderness that belied his calloused strength. "You brought color into a world I only knew in shades of survival, taught me there could be more than just enduring each day alone." Eliza held these vulnerable admissions close within her heart, understanding their precious rarity from a man who had learned to guard himself against a world that had offered little beyond loss and suspicion. Recognizing that in their shared danger, something unexpected had bloomed between the refined widow and the mountain survivor, something neither had been seeking, but both now desperately needed to protect alongside the secrets they carried. Dawn brought no improvement to Jamie's condition, his skin burning with fever that seemed to consume him from within while the wound on his arm had swollen alarmingly, angry red lines now tracking toward his heart beneath skin pulled taut and shiny. Eliza wrung out another cloth in rainwater collected from the leaking roof, placing it across his forehead as he thrashed weakly against unseen demons, his incoherent murmurs occasionally forming her name like a lifeline in his delirium. The meager supplies in their packs offered nothing to combat the infection steadily claiming him, their careful planning never accounting for a wound that would fester despite her best efforts to keep it clean. Desperation clawed at Eliza's throat as she watched Jamie's labored breathing, understanding with terrible clarity that without intervention, the mountain boy who had saved her life would not survive another night. The choice crystallized before her like frost forming on glass, remain hidden as their pursuers combed the forest, or risk exposure by venturing out to find what might save him. Standing at the grimy window, watching the storm finally releasing its grip as weak sunlight penetrated the cloud cover, Eliza recalled Jamie's patient lessons during their days at the cabin. "Yellowroot grows near water," he had explained, showing her the distinctive leaves and golden stems, "makes a paste that draws infection from wounds better than any doctor's medicine." Later, pointing to purple coneflowers nodding in a sunny clearing, "Echinacea strengthens the body's fight against sickness." The memory of his teachings settled her resolve, her refined hands checking the crude knife at her belt with newfound confidence born of necessity. Jamie stirred as she prepared to leave, his fever-bright eyes fixing on her face with momentary clarity. "Don't go," he whispered, fingers weakly catching at her sleeve. "They'll find you." The forest beyond the cabin door seemed transformed by her purpose. No longer an alien landscape of threats, but a potential ally holding remedies if she could only remember Jamie's lessons. Following the sound of running water, she discovered yellowroot growing in abundance, exactly as he had described, her fingers harvesting the golden roots with careful precision. Hours passed as she searched methodically for each plant Jamie had named, her city boots now confident on uneven ground, her senses gradually attuning to the forest's subtle warnings when strangers passed nearby. The sun hung low when Eliza finally returned, only to find fresh boot prints in the mud near their shelter, the distinctive tread of city shoes rather than mountain boots. Inside, Jamie remained mercifully alone and unconscious as she worked through the night, grinding roots into paste and brewing bitter teas, forcing medicine between his lips and packing the angry wound with poultices that gradually drew poison from his flesh. By morning, his fever had broken, leaving him weak but lucid, his eyes following her movements with quiet wonder. "You saved me," he stated simply, the weight of those 3 words carrying acknowledgement of her transformation. Eliza's relieved smile faltered only slightly as she glanced toward the window, knowing that in saving Jamie's life, she had left a trail through the forest that experienced trackers would follow directly to their door. The distant crack of branches breaking jolted them both awake before dawn. Jamie instantly alert despite his weakened state as he motioned Eliza to silence while reaching for his knife with trembling fingers. Through gaps in the cabin's weathered boards, they watched a solitary figure approaching cautiously. Neither the confident stride of Richard's hunters nor the familiar gait of local mountain folk, but something in between, deliberate yet uncertain in this terrain. When the stranger called out, his voice carrying an educated accent that placed him from neither Boston nor these mountains, Jamie made a swift decision born of desperation, positioning Eliza behind the door with his knife while he feigned greater weakness than he felt, creating a tableau designed to lower the intruder's guard. The door swung open to reveal a man in his 30s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, his clothing suggesting city origins but adapted for wilderness travel. A leather satchel slung across his body bearing the unmistakable bulk of a camera. "Daniel Cooper, Boston Chronicle," he announced, hands carefully visible and empty, gaze darting between Jamie's apparent helplessness and the knife barely concealed in Eliza's white-knuckled grip. "I've been tracking Harrington Mining's activities for 18 months, following the same trail that got Charles Harrington killed." The name hung in the air like smoke, Eliza's sharp intake of breath causing Cooper to focus fully on her face, recognition dawning in his expression. "Mrs. Harrington," he breathed, wonder and relief mingling in his voice. "They're saying you murdered your household staff and stole company documents before fleeing, but I knew it couldn't be true, not after what Charles shared with me before his death." Cautious questions revealed Cooper had been investigating Richard's corrupt dealings long before Charles discovered them, building a case against environmental violations and bribery of officials, his journalist's instincts leading him to these mountains when whispers of Eliza's escape reached his carefully cultivated sources. "Richard has mobilized everything," Cooper explained as they shared their meager breakfast, his notebook open beside him filled with precise handwriting that reminded Eliza painfully of Charles. Private security forces disguised as federal agents, local bounty hunters promised rewards that would buy half the county, even legitimate authorities misled by falsified evidence of your alleged crimes. He spread a detailed map across the rough table, marking locations where he had observed search parties. "They're combing these mountains with unprecedented resources because what you carry could expose operations worth billions. Not just the mineral deposits themselves, but the entire network of corruption that secured them illegally." Jamie and Eliza exchanged wary glances. Years of learned distrust, warring with desperate need for allies, as Cooper detailed his plan to escort them to a federal prosecutor in Knoxville, who had been quietly gathering evidence against Richard, but lacked the definitive proof, contained in Samuel's box and Charles's journal. "I have a vehicle hidden 5 miles east," Cooper continued, his manner confident without crossing into arrogance, "and press credentials that will get us through checkpoints Richard has established on major roads. Combined with what you carry, we could bring the entire operation down within days, rather than the years I've spent chipping away at its edges." As morning light strengthened around them, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cabin's stale air, Jamie found himself studying the journalist's face for signs of deception, while Eliza questioned him on details only someone truly connected to Charles would know, both seeking certainty before trusting this stranger with not only their evidence but their lives. The promise of justice tantalizingly close yet shadowed by years of betrayal that had taught them the highest price is often paid for misplaced trust. The eastern path Daniel chose led them away from the higher ridges Jamie would have selected, instead following a valley that gradually widened as they descended, the journalist maintaining a steady stream of conversation that combined reassurances about their safety with questions about exactly what evidence they carried. Though still weakened from infection, Jamie found his senses heightening with each mile. Small inconsistencies in their guide's behavior, triggering the survival instincts honed through years of solitary existence in these mountains. Daniel checked his watch too frequently, adjusted their pace when they made better time than expected, and most troublingly, seemed to guide them deliberately past clear vantage points, where they would be visible from surrounding slopes, behavior that contradicted his claimed desire for secrecy. By midday, Jamie had silently caught Eliza's eye, a subtle shake of his head communicating warnings he dared not voice, as they continued following the journalist who had become increasingly insistent about examining the documents they carried, claiming he needed to prepare his story before they reached authorities. The confirmation of betrayal came as they paused near a stream crossing. Daniel, stepping away ostensibly to refill water bottles but moving just far enough into the trees to believe himself unobserved, while retrieving a small radio from his satchel, his hushed voice carrying clearly to Jamie, who had silently circled behind him. Approaching the eastern clearing within the hour, Daniel murmured into the device, "Both targets with me, all materials secured in the Blackwell boys' pack, minimal resistance expected given his condition." The crackling response sent ice through Jamie's veins, a voice he didn't recognize confirming positions and instructing Daniel to lead them through the clearing center where lines of fire were already established. Jamie retreated without sound, finding Eliza already alert to his absence, her eyes widening at his urgent gesture toward the dense forest opposite Daniel's position just as the journalist returned. Water bottles conspicuously unfilled but smile firmly in place. Their escape unfolded in heartbeats. Jamie suddenly stumbling against Daniel with apologies about his weakened state, the momentary distraction allowing Eliza to slip into the tree line while Jamie followed an instant later, ignoring Daniel's shouts as they plunged into undergrowth too dense for easy pursuit. They were barely 50 yards into the forest when the first shots splintered bark around them, Daniel's furious voice calling to hidden gunmen whose positions became apparent as bullets converged from multiple directions, forcing Jamie and Eliza to crawl through drainages and thorn thickets that shredded clothing but offered precious concealment from their pursuers. For hours they fled with the desperate energy of prey animals, Jamie's intimate knowledge of forest movement keeping them just ahead of the search parties whose radio communications occasionally reached them, revealing coordination far beyond local hunters or even corporate security. The clinical precision of the pursuit suggesting resources available only to those with government connections or influence. Nightfall finally brought temporary reprieve as they huddled beneath a rock overhang miles from where they had fled, their possessions reduced to only what they carried in their clothing, and Jamie's small pack containing the precious documents, the true scope of what they faced becoming devastatingly clear. "It's not just Richard or the company," Eliza whispered, her refined composure finally cracking to reveal bone-deep fear beneath. "There must be officials involved, people with authority, power structures that extend far beyond what even Charles suspected." Jamie nodded grimly, his father's warnings about trusting outsiders now carrying new weight, as he realized that the secrets they protected threatened not just corporate profits, but an entire system of power and corruption. Their two lives insignificant obstacles to forces that would destroy these mountains and everyone connected to them without hesitation or remorse. The eastern path Daniel chose led them away from the higher ridges Jamie would have selected, instead following a valley that gradually widened as they descended, the journalist maintaining a steady stream of conversation that combined reassurances about their safety with questions about exactly what evidence they carried. Though still weakened from infection, Jamie found his senses heightening with each mile, small inconsistencies in their guide's behavior triggering the survival instincts honed through years of solitary existence in these mountains. Daniel checked his watch too frequently, adjusted their pace when they made better time than expected, and most troublingly, seemed to guide them deliberately past clear vantage points where they would be visible from surrounding slopes, behavior that contradicted his claimed desire for secrecy. By midday, Jamie had silently caught Eliza's eye, a subtle shake of his head communicating warnings he dared not voice as they continued following the journalist who had become increasingly insistent about examining the documents they carried, claiming he needed to prepare his story before they reached authorities. The confirmation of betrayal came as they paused near a stream crossing, Daniel stepping away ostensibly to refill water bottles, but moving just far enough into the trees to believe himself unobserved while retrieving a small radio from his satchel, his hushed voice carrying clearly to Jamie, who had silently circled behind him. Approaching the eastern clearing within the hour, Daniel murmured into the device, "Both targets with me, all materials secured in the Blackwell boys' pack." minimal resistance expected given his condition. The crackling response sent ice through Jamie's veins, a voice he didn't recognize confirming positions and instructing Daniel to lead them through the clearing center where lines of fire were already established. Jamie retreated without sound, finding Eliza already alert to his absence, her eyes widening at his urgent gesture toward the dense forest opposite Daniel's position just as the journalist returned, water bottles conspicuously unfilled but smile firmly in place. Their escape unfolded in heartbeats, Jamie suddenly stumbling against Daniel with apologies about his weakened state, the momentary distraction allowing Eliza to slip into the tree line while Jamie followed an instant later, ignoring Daniel's shouts as they plunged into undergrowth too dense for easy pursuit. They were barely 50 yards into the forest when the first shots splintered bark around them, Daniel's furious voice calling to hidden gunmen whose positions became apparent as bullets converged from multiple directions, forcing Jamie and Eliza to crawl through drainages and thorn thickets that shredded clothing but offered precious concealment from their pursuers. For hours they fled with the desperate energy of prey animals, Jamie's intimate knowledge of forest movement keeping them just ahead of the search parties whose radio communications occasionally reached them, revealing coordination far beyond local hunters or even corporate security, the clinical precision of the pursuit suggesting resources available only to those with government connections or influence. Nightfall finally brought temporary reprieve as they huddled beneath a rock overhang miles from where they had fled, their possessions reduced to only what they carried in their clothing, and Jamie's small pack containing the precious documents, the true scope of what they faced becoming devastatingly clear. "It's not just Richard or the company," Eliza whispered, her refined composure finally cracking to reveal bone-deep fear beneath. "There must be officials involved, people with authority, power structures that extend far beyond what even Charles suspected." Jamie nodded grimly, his father's warnings about trusting outsiders now carrying new weight as he realized that the secrets they protected threatened not just corporate profits, but an entire system of power and corruption. Their two lives insignificant obstacles to forces that would destroy these mountains and everyone connected to them without hesitation or remorse. Moonlight filtered through high clouds as Jamie led Eliza along a route so obscure it barely existed, following narrow game trails that vanished into stream beds, traversing slick rock faces that held no footprints, and occasionally creating their own path through dense rhododendron thickets that closed behind them like watery gates, erasing all evidence of their passage. 3 days of constant movement had hollowed their cheeks and darkened the skin beneath their eyes. Meager rations stretched thin as they circled wide around search parties whose distant voices occasionally carried on the wind, the betrayal by Daniel hardening their resolve while eliminating any hope of outside assistance. "We have one advantage they don't expect," Jamie whispered as they paused beneath a massive hemlock to share their last strips of dried venison, his voice rough from disuse and exhaustion. "They believe we're still trying to escape the mountains, not returning to where our journey began." Eliza studied his face in the dappled moonlight, noting how the mountain boy who had once seemed impossibly young now carried himself with the weathered determination of someone who had seen too much, her own transformation from refined widow to wilderness survivor reflected in his gaze. They moved only during pre-dawn gray or after dusk, the daylight hours spent in concealment as helicopters occasionally thundered overhead, mechanical intrusions in a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. As familiar ridgelines finally appeared on their 6th night of travel, Jamie paused atop an outcropping that offered momentary visibility of the valley that held his cabin, miles distant but recognizable to eyes that knew its contours. "My father built the cabin when I was too young to remember," he explained, voice low as though sharing secrets with the night itself. "But it wasn't until I was 8 that he showed me why he chose that specific location, taking me beneath the root cellar to a chamber he had excavated into the limestone beneath, connected to natural caves that run deep into the mountain." Eliza's eyes widened as understanding dawned, Jamie continuing with newfound urgency as clouds threatened to obscure their moonlight. "He spent winters expanding those chambers whenever I thought he was simply hunting, creating storage spaces and escape routes I've never fully explored, telling me they were insurance against a day he prayed would never come." The final approach to the cabin required every ounce of caution they possessed, circles growing wider as they detected signs of recent activity, boot prints and discarded cigarette packets revealing that Richard's men had indeed discovered Jamie's home but apparently believed it abandoned, their attention directed outward toward escape routes rather than inward towards secrets buried in stone. under cover of a midnight storm that masked their movements with rumbling thunder and driving rain. They finally slipped through the forest edge to the cabin's rear entrance, a concealed door Jamie had built into the foundation stones specifically for returning unobserved. Water cascaded from their soaked clothing as they entered the root cellar, Jamie's hands running along rough wooden shelving until finding the hidden latch that caused an entire section of wall to swing inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "No one knows these chambers exist except us," Jamie whispered, striking a match that illuminated rough-hewn steps descending into darkness. "Not even old Martha or the townspeople who believed they knew every secret my father kept, which means for the first time since Daniel's betrayal, we have a momentary advantage in a game where every previous move has been anticipated by those hunting us." The limestone chamber beneath the cabin opened before them like a secret world, Jamie's lantern illuminating walls lined with metal filing cabinets and wooden crates stacked with methodical precision, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the cabin above. Maps covered one entire wall, far more detailed than the fragments in Eliza's locket, showing the entire Appalachian Range with specific locations marked in Samuel Blackwell's precise handwriting. Each annotation accompanied by geological symbols and mineral composition percentages that Eliza recognized from her husband's research. The chamber smelled of dry paper and stone, preserved from the elements in this underground sanctuary that seemed to exist outside of time, as though Samuel Blackwell had created a vault where truth could remain untouched by those who sought to corrupt it for profit. Jamie moved with quiet reverence through his father's hidden domain, fingers tracing labels on file drawers until finding one marked simply Origins in faded ink, the metal squeaking in protest as he pulled it open to reveal leather-bound journals arranged chronologically, the earliest dating back nearly 40 years. As Eliza sorted through survey documents that provided irrefutable evidence of the mineral deposit's locations and value, Jamie settled at a small desk bolted to the stone floor, the most recent journal open before him, his father's final written words illuminated in the lantern's golden glow. The silence between them grew heavy as Jamie turned pages with increasing urgency, his breath catching audibly as he reached entries from the weeks before his parents' deaths. Passages so revelatory that his hands trembled visibly against the weathered paper. "Eliza," he called, his voice tight with emotion that transcended his usual mountain stoicism. "You need to see this." The journal entry he indicated began not with geological notations but with personal history long concealed. "Should anything happen to me, my son must someday know the truth I've hidden to protect him." The man known as Charles Harrington, whose company I once served and later fled, is not merely my former employer but my brother, James Blackwell by birth, who changed his name upon inheriting the Harrington mining interests from our maternal grandfather, while I kept our father's surname when choosing a different path. Eliza's knees weakened as she read further, learning how the brothers had maintained their connection in secret after Samuel discovered the mineral deposits and refused to disclose their locations, Charles providing protection from within the company while they gathered evidence against those who would exploit the land without regard for its people or future. "We brothers chose different worlds," Samuel had written, "but shared principles stronger than blood, knowing that should our enemies discover our connection, they would destroy not only us but the next generation, my son Jamie and Charles's stepdaughter Eliza, cousins who have never met but who inherit our obligation to protect what cannot be replaced." The final passages revealed Samuel's growing fear, as Charles reported suspicious activities within the company, culminating in a warning that Richard Thornton had somehow learned of their brotherhood and was systematically dismantling their protective measures. The truth settled around Jamie and Eliza like invisible bonds, their chance meeting now revealed as the convergence of bloodlines long separated but never truly severed. Their shared determination to protect these mountains suddenly explained by inheritance deeper than either had imagined. "We're family," Eliza whispered, her refined hand covering Jamie's calloused one atop the journal that had rewritten their understanding of themselves. "Not just allies against Richard, but bound by something that began before either of us was born." The first sign of discovery came at dawn, birds falling suddenly silent as unfamiliar engines rumbled along the overgrown access road, their mechanical intrusion shattering the mountain morning's peace. Jamie was already moving before the sounds registered fully, his body responding to danger signals that had kept him alive since childhood, as he urged Eliza to gather their most crucial evidence while he secured the cabin's vulnerable points. Through gaps in the carefully positioned shutters, they watched as vehicles formed a perimeter around the clearing, disgorging men with military precision. Their weapons and communications equipment far exceeding typical security forces. Among them strode a distinguished figure whose expensive suit seemed incongruous against the wilderness backdrop, his silver hair and commanding posture marking him unmistakably as Richard Thornton even before his cultured voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Blackwell, we know you're inside," he called, the reasonable tone belied by the armed men spreading into strategic positions. "This unfortunate situation has escalated beyond what any of us intended, but we can still resolve it without further bloodshed." Jamie worked methodically despite the growing tension, barricading doors with furniture and securing shutters with hidden bolts his father had installed years ago. Preparations for a siege they both knew could not last against the forces gathering outside. Eliza organized their documentary evidence into waterproof containers, prioritizing Samuel's original surveys and Charles's journal, while Jamie retrieved his father's old hunting rifle from its hiding place above the fireplace, the 5 remaining bullets a token defense against the arsenal surrounding them. Richard's patience evaporated with the morning dew as their silence answered his false offers of negotiation, his next command sharp with authority that expected immediate obedience. "Prepare to breach on my signal, and remember, we need those documents intact, even if the carriers are damaged." The first assault came against the rear door, wood splintering under coordinated blows that tested Jamie's barricade, forcing them to retreat toward the cabin's center as windows shattered simultaneously, tear gas canisters bouncing across rough floorboards and filling the space with choking clouds. The attack paused briefly as the gas dissipated, the temporary reprieve ending with a new horror as the distinctive odor of accelerant reached them, followed by the hungry crackling of flames taking hold along the cabin's eastern wall, where decades-old timber provided perfect fuel. "They're burning us out," Jamie stated with grim certainty, the mountain boy's typical understatement masking desperate calculation as smoke began seeping through wallboards. Heat intensified rapidly around them, as fire claimed the small home that had sheltered generations of Blackwells, the roof timbers groaning ominously overhead while Richard's voice continued issuing commands to recover whatever survived the blaze. With practiced movements born from years of preparation for this very moment, Jamie slid aside the heavy braided rug concealing the root cellar's entrance, the trapdoor beneath revealing their only escape route as flames claimed the room's corners. Eliza descended first, the waterproof pack containing their evidence secured tightly against her body, Jamie following with his father's rifle as fire roared through the cabin above them, the heavy trapdoor closing with finality as they retreated into the underground chamber that represented their final defensive position against forces that had already destroyed everything else they possessed. Smoke filtered through invisible cracks in the limestone ceiling as Jamie and Eliza huddled in the farthest corner of the underground chamber, the distant roar of the consuming fire punctuated by occasional crashes as roof timbers surrendered to gravity and flame. Their momentary safety felt increasingly tenuous as the temperature rose around them. The ancient ventilation channels Samuel had incorporated into his hideaway, now drawing superheated air from the inferno above, transforming their refuge into an oven that threatened slow suffocation if the fire continued unchecked. Just as despair threatened to claim them, new sounds penetrated their underground sanctuary, the unmistakable wail of sirens followed by shouted commands and, most surprisingly, the authoritative voice of old Martha cutting through the chaos with surprising strength for her advanced years. "Federal agents, weapons down immediately," a megaphoned voice boomed, followed instantly by the distinctive pop of gunfire erupting above, the underground chamber amplifying each shot into thunderous percussion that seemed to shake dust from the stone walls surrounding them. Jamie and Eliza exchanged glances of stunned hope as understanding dawned that somehow Martha had brought legitimate authorities to their aid, the crafty mountain woman apparently harboring connections neither had suspected during their years of acquaintance. Their momentary relief shattered as the hidden entrance to their sanctuary suddenly shifted, the cleverly designed stone door swinging inward to reveal Richard Thornton himself, his expensive suit now smoke-stained and torn, silver hair disheveled but eyes burning with cold fury as he descended into their final hiding place, a sleek pistol gripped in one manicured hand, while the other clutched a bloody shoulder where a bullet had found its mark during his desperate dash through the chaos erupting above. "How perfectly fitting to find you both cowering in a hole beneath the earth you fought so desperately to protect," he snarled, aristocratic composure abandoned as the gunfire intensified overhead. his gaze darting between them before fixing on the waterproof pack containing their evidence. Decades of planning, billions in potential profits, connections cultivated with presidents and prime ministers, all jeopardized by a mountain peasant and a grieving widow who couldn't leave well enough alone. The corporate titan advanced with predatory focus, the pistol unwavering despite his injury. His attention momentarily divided as he assessed which of them carried the documents he needed to recover before making his escape through channels certainly prepared for such contingencies. That momentary distraction provided the opening Jamie had been anticipating, his body tensing to lunge toward the intruder, despite the certain knowledge that Richard's bullet would find him before he could cross the intervening space. A sacrifice he prepared to make so Eliza might survive to bring the truth to light. The decision crystallized in his eyes, a silent message Eliza recognized instantly with horror, her refined features transforming with determination as she subtly shifted her weight. The two orphans prepared to make their final stand against the man responsible for destroying both their families, the gunfire above reaching crescendo as federal agents battled Richard's mercenaries for control of the burning cabin, while below, in Samuel Blackwell's secret chamber, three figures remained locked in a tableau of vengeance, justice, and desperation that would determine not just their own fates but the future of mountains that had silently witnessed generations of human struggle upon their ancient slopes. The underground chamber grew silent as Richard circled them like a predator toying with wounded prey, his pistol shifting between Jamie and Eliza while distant gunfire continued overhead, muffled by stone and earth that had protected Blackwell's secrets for generations. "You two have proven remarkably resilient," Richard observed, his cultured voice incongruous in the rough-hewn space, "much like your fathers before you, though they ultimately proved disappointingly vulnerable to arranged accidents and staged suicides." The casual admission of murder hung in the stale air as he continued, satisfaction evident in his tone as he detailed crimes long concealed behind corporate legitimacy. Samuel was relatively simple, his mountain driving habits making a tampered brake line appear tragically accidental, though I confess Charles required more creativity given his position and connections. The perfect suicide scene arranged while he slept, thanks to a sedative in his evening bourbon. Eliza's sharp intake of breath drew Richard's cold smile as he elaborated with the liberating honesty of someone who intentionally believed his audience would soon be silenced permanently. "The mineral deposits your fathers died protecting are merely the beginning, the first phase of operations that will ultimately reshape this entire region into the world's primary source of elements essential to modern technology. Wealth beyond imagination for those positioned correctly, myself among them." His wounded shoulder seemed forgotten as he warmed to his subject, decades of carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise spilling forth with pride rather than remorse. 12 witnesses eliminated over 20 years, each death meticulously crafted to appear unconnected, while government officials and regulatory agencies were systematically compromised through combinations of bribery, blackmail, and mutual interest. As Richard spoke, Jamie's eyes tracked almost imperceptibly toward a section of wall where a peculiar pattern of stones had fascinated him since childhood, his father's voice echoing from memory with instructions he had never fully understood until this moment. "Only in greatest need, son, when all other paths are closed." Richard's attention focused primarily on Eliza as she deliberately engaged him with questions about Charles, her refined manners masking the calculating intelligence that kept him explaining his brilliance while Jamie's fingers found the hidden depression in the seemingly solid stone, pressing with desperate strength until an audible click reverberated through the chamber. Richard spun toward the sound as water suddenly gushed from concealed pipes Samuel had integrated into the limestone, an emergency measure designed to flood the chamber if discovery threatened the secrets it contained. The unexpected deluge struck Richard with physical force, momentarily disrupting his balance on the slick stone floor, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as Jamie launched himself forward with all the power his mountain-hardened body could generate. They collided violently, Richard's superior size countered by Jamie's youth and determination as they struggled for control of the weapon, water continuing to pour from multiple sources as Eliza seized a heavy survey marker from a nearby shelf, bringing it down with precision against Richard's wounded shoulder. His agonized scream echoing through the flooding chamber as the pistol finally clattered from nerveless fingers into the rising water. Jamie's knowledge of his father's hidden mechanisms proved decisive as he navigated the increasingly treacherous footing with instinctive familiarity, maintaining his advantage until Richard finally slumped unconscious from combined pain and exertion. The corporate titan who had orchestrated murders and environmental devastation, now rendered harmless by the very defensive systems Samuel Blackwell had created to protect his discoveries from men exactly like Richard Thornton. Morning sunlight streamed through courthouse windows as Jamie and Eliza sat side by side on a polished wooden bench. Their appearances transformed by clean clothes and recent rest, yet still bearing shadows of their ordeal in the hollows beneath their eyes and the watchful alertness that survival had permanently etched into their postures. 3 weeks had passed since federal agents had pulled them from the flooding underground chamber. Richard Thornton secured in handcuffs while helicopters evacuated them from the smoldering remains of the cabin to a secure facility where their evidence was catalogued with meticulous care by Justice Department officials, untouched by the corruption that had claimed so many others. The extensive documentation provided by Samuel's hidden files and Charles's journals had triggered investigative avalanches across multiple states, each day bringing news of additional arrests as the conspiracy unraveled with breathtaking speed. Corrupt officials and corporate conspirators falling like autumn leaves as decades of criminal activities were systematically exposed. Richard himself sat in a high-security detention center, awaiting trial on 17 counts of murder and dozens of additional charges, ranging from environmental crimes to racketeering. His formerly immaculate reputation shredded beyond repair as former allies rushed to provide testimony in exchange for leniency, the house of cards he had constructed now collapsing under its own corrupt weight. Old Martha had emerged as an unexpected hero in the saga, her decades of quiet observation and careful record-keeping revealed as deliberate evidence-gathering for a federal investigation that had been building slowly, waiting for the definitive proof that Jamie and Eliza had finally provided. The mountain woman's appearance at the courthouse that morning drew respectful nods from federal agents who had come to appreciate her shrewd intelligence beneath the rustic exterior that had fooled so many, including Richard, into underestimating her significance. Most significant for Jamie and Eliza personally was the revelation delivered that morning by Charles Harrington's former attorney, now working to untangle the deliberately complicated legal structures Richard had created to conceal ownership and inheritance rights. With Richard's manipulations reversed and Charles's true will finally executed, the elderly lawyer explained, spreading documents across the table before them. The Harrington estate passes to Eliza as his daughter by marriage but legally adopted as his heir, while the Blackwell properties, significantly expanded by recent court rulings, returned to Jamie with clear title and substantial compensation for damages. The attorney paused, removing his glasses to emphasize his next statement. Most significantly, Eliza now controls 51% of Harrington Mining Company shares, making her the majority owner with complete authority to determine its future operations and focus. The weight of this inheritance settled around Eliza's shoulders, her refined features showing the careful consideration Charles had instilled in her regarding the responsibilities wealth carried, while beside her, Jamie displayed similar contemplation about land's return to his stewardship. Both cousins, united by blood only recently discovered but more powerfully connected by shared principles their fathers had valued above wealth or status. The environmental impact assessments Samuel had preserved provided foundation for sweeping protections now being implemented across the Appalachian region, with restoration funds established to heal damage already inflicted by earlier mining operations. Justice extending beyond their personal vindication to encompass the mountains themselves and communities that had suffered from corporate exploitation. Later, standing on the courthouse steps as journalists recorded the latest developments in what newspapers had dubbed the Appalachian Conspiracy, Jamie and Eliza faced their future with the quiet strength their ordeal had forged. Justice for their families finally secured, but bringing with it new responsibilities neither had sought, yet both were now determined to fulfill with the same integrity that had cost Samuel Blackwell and Charles Harrington their lives, but ultimately triumphed through the next generation they had raised, to value truth above profit and preservation above exploitation. Autumn painted the Appalachian slopes in brilliant golds and crimsons as Jamie stood on the newly constructed porch of his rebuilt cabin. 18 years of life now officially marked as morning mist rose from the valley where generations of Blackwells had found both sanctuary and purpose. The cabin, larger than its predecessor, yet crafted with the same reverence for the land, stood as testament to resilience, its foundation incorporating stones salvaged from the original structure, while its modern amenities reflected the changes 6 months had brought to the once isolated mountain boy's existence. Inside, where the scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread replaced memories of smoke and fear, Eliza arranged a small gathering of meaningful objects on the hand-carved table that centered the main room, her refined elegance now comfortably blended with practical mountain sensibilities. City clothes exchanged for durable fabrics better suited to her new life, dividing time between corporate boardrooms and forest trails. "Your father wanted your 18th birthday to mark your readiness for the truth," she said as Jamie entered, gesturing toward a cherrywood box that echoed Samuel's craftsmanship but bore new carvings, integrating both Harrington and Blackwell family symbols. "And though that truth found you earlier than he intended, I thought it fitting to honor his wishes with something that looks to the future rather than the past." The box opened without secrets or hidden mechanisms, revealing documents bound with the official seals of both federal agencies and corporate entities, the topmost bearing the newly registered name, the Harrington Blackwell Foundation, in elegant script above mission statements detailing preservation initiatives for 30,000 acres of mountain wilderness and educational scholarships for children from mining communities. Fund allocations directed mineral extraction profits towards sustainable development programs, while establishing permanent conservation easements, ensuring the mountains would remain protected regardless of changing political profits. Landscapes, Samuel's geological knowledge and Charles's business acumen living on through their children's combined vision. "We've transformed what they died protecting into something that will nurture rather than exploit," Eliza explained, her hand finding Jamie's with the easy familiarity that had grown between them, their shared blood less significant than shared purpose in creating family from the ashes of tragedy. Outside, voices approached along the forest path as old Martha led a small procession of townspeople, carrying baskets and packages. The mountain community that had once whispered about Blackwell curses, now embracing the legacy Samuel had protected and the future his son was building. Acceptance, replacing isolation as truth displaced secrets. The mountains themselves seemed to approve as sunlight broke through morning clouds to illuminate the clearing. The same peaks that had witnessed generations of struggle now bearing witness to redemption and renewal, their ancient slopes guarded not by solitary sacrifice, but by united purpose, given formal structure through legal protections and financial commitments that would endure beyond individual lives. Jamie's gaze met Eliza's across the room, words unnecessary between two souls who had journeyed from complete strangers to something deeper than friendship, their connection formed in danger but flourishing in peace. Neither the refined Boston widow nor the isolated mountain boy who had first encountered each other during a spring storm, but something new forged through shared hardship and triumph, a family created not through traditional bonds but through chosen kinship, stronger for having been tested by fire and betrayal yet emerging intact. A legacy worthy of the fathers whose protective instincts had unknowingly guided their children toward each other and toward the preservation of both wilderness and truth they now ensured together.